Well, just a warning that some people might find the image I'm about to show you deeply distressing. Her name was Amal Hussein. She's 7 years old, pictured here lying motionless on a hospital bed. She's starving. She's been brought in by her family who could no longer afford to feed her. She's lying here, medical teams desperately trying to keep her alive, giving her small portions of milk every 2 hours. But she's vomiting, she's suffering with terrible diarrhea. Her condition is very poor indeed. This is not the first time she's had to come into hospital. This photograph was published by the New York Times by two journalists who went to Yemen to show the scale of the suffering. It shocked the world, it really shocked people. And yet, just days after it was published, Amal died. 3 days before her death, she'd been discharged from hospital, not because she was better, but because there was no room left. They needed the beds for other patients. Her family could not afford to take her to another aid station. And so, on the 26th of October, Amal died at home. I spoke to Declan Walsh, a journalist with the New York Times, who was there with the photographer Tyler Hicks and took this photograph. And I started by asking him what he remembers of first seeing Amal.
When we walked into that hospital, it was immediately obvious that there were a lot of very sick people there. And the doctor directed us towards Amal. She was a young girl who was lying deathly still. Her mother was sitting over her. She told us that they were refugees from another part of the country. Their home had been bombed in Sada along the border with Saudi Arabia. They had now moved to this area that was a little bit safer. But over this year, it seems the family ran out of an ability to feed itself. And so Amal had grown very sick. When we saw her, it was maybe the second or third time that she had come into a hospital for treatment for malnutrition, and she was seriously ill. She looked in a terrible state, as you can see from the photographs, with her very thin arms and legs and her ribs showing, and she was suffering not just from malnutrition but also, like many such children, from diarrhea and vomiting as well, which was making her condition worse.
Declan, you spent some time there alongside a photographer reporting on the ground, travelling through the country. Tell us a bit about what that was like and what you saw.
We travelled to the north, to Sana'a, the capital, and to this province of Hajjah, where we found so many of these cases, like Amal. And there, one of the most striking things was that on the surface, you see cities that are functioning fairly normally. You see supermarkets that are full of food. You see restaurants that are bustling and operating. But then you also realize that maybe 2 or 3 streets away from those supermarkets or those bazaars, you find hospitals with dying children. And that's simply because this is not a crisis that is about a shortage of food. This is a crisis that comes from people's inability to pay for that food.
It's a crisis that comes from 3.5 years of a bitter war in Yemen, with a Saudi-led coalition armed and backed by the West clashing with Houthi rebels, and stuck in the middle, young children like Amal. And she has become the face of the suffering shared by millions. 1.8 million children in Yemen are severely malnourished. 8 million people in that country depend on emergency food supplies, and there's a warning that famine could grip the country, and that the number of people dependent on that emergency food could rise to half of the country's population. And if that happens, if the country is gripped by this famine, the costs, the reality for people, little children like Amal, well, it doesn't bear thinking about.